All right, welcome back, everyone. Everyone hear me okay in the back? Yes, 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 excellent. Still our second class, so I'm gonna give folks just a little bit of extra time to show up, but in the meantime, everyone's first week going well? Anybody roll their car into a ravine, run away from a rattlesnake, wipe their butt with poison oak, and get sprayed by a skunk? No? Nobody? Well, if you did, you'd be very prepared after Tuesday, so. All right, cool. So we will go ahead and jump back into our discussion of natural history in California. But first, we ended our last lecture with a little bit of an ecological mystery, specifically the idea that in vernal pools, these very temporary bodies of water we see in grasslands sometimes, early natural scientists or naturalists found these living fairy shrimp, very large invertebrates swimming around in the water of areas that had been bone dry for 5 or 6 years. And it turns out there was actually a kind of cool natural history explanation for it. Anybody know this one or look up in the interim at all? Yeah, feel like summarizing the upshot of it at all? What's that? More or less, exactly right. So cryptobiosis is one of our very jargony terms to talk about the idea that some living things can live in this very, very low energy, low key state over long periods of time. And so it turns out that these fairy shrimp have what we call encysted eggs. When they lay their eggs, they're encased in this very durable, almost leathery outside pseudo shell. And it turns out that these eggs, these encysted eggs, can survive dry conditions in these vernal pools for years. This animal egg, this little sort of proto-fairy shrimp, can survive in dry, heat-blasted ground for apparently up to a decade with no water whatsoever. And what happens is these eggs, they have adapted to be able to wait for perfect conditions. They wait for a year, for a season where they get a lot of rain, the vernal pool fills up, becomes wet again, and then all of a sudden they hatch and it's go, 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 go. These fairy shrimp can complete an entire life cycle, hatch, grow to adult size, reproduce, and lay the next generation of encysted eggs in weeks, right? Which is often as long as these vernal pools last. Here's what a similar species eggs looks like here, right? And so this is a great example of a California species that is adapted to really take advantage of these variable and kind of unique conditions over time. This animal population for 90% of its lifetime might be a little cryptobiotic, barely alive egg, and then a rainstorm happens, all of a sudden it's alive for 3 weeks and then it's dead, right? Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so on Tuesday, a lot of you all were kind enough to fill out some of our little note cards, kind of specifying some of the community standards that we wanted to set both for each other and for me in relation to you. So I went through all those and kind of summarized some of the most frequent ones for yourselves, kind of the same ones I get whenever I do this exercise, which is always cool to see. Biggest one, please don't distract one another. A lot of folks talked about eating noisy foods, watching videos on your phone or laptop while I'm lecturing, having side conversations, that sort of thing. So do please be conscious of that. A lot of folks said in some way or another, please be kind and collaborative. Don't judge stupid questions. There is no such thing. Please understand that a lot of folks in this class, especially where we have a lot of diverse expertises and foci, all perspectives are valuable, so please don't judge anyone who has a different perspective than yours. And then a big one that comes up every year is please be considerate of personal space and hygiene. It's not a massive room. If you smell bad, it's not always pleasant for your colleagues, so do please be careful about that. On that note, illness, if you're feeling sick, one of the nice things about this course is that we record all of our lectures. I really encourage folks to come. I'm really glad you all did. But if you're feeling bad, please don't feel pressure to attend and get other folks sick. You're always welcome to stay home and watch the lecture remotely. Sound good? Cool. For me, a couple of folks, things that came up frequently, clear expectations and deadlines. I will do my absolute best to reinforce things like due dates, when things are expected, what I'm expecting, that sort of thing. Prompt feedback, my policy, and the policy that our TAs are also helping out with, is we try to get all assignments back within 1 week of when they're turned in. We'll do our absolute best to stick to that. So prompt feedback there. Interactivity and engagement were requested often from you guys, and that is a lot of fun. I enjoy that too. So things like in-class discussions, call and response, that sort of stuff, we'll be doing quite a bit of. And one big one, especially for a course like this that I appreciate folks mentioning, is no assumptions about expertise. Certainly not all of us in here are biologists by training. That's why a lot of us are here, which I really love. And so if I ever use a piece of jargon or vocabulary or some kind of weird esoteric term that has to do with biology, please don't hesitate to throw something at me and say, hey, Rob, I don't know what that means. And we'll stop and define it. It's kind of something I do out of habit. I'm trying to catch myself as best I can. But please, if I use a term you're not familiar with, stop me, and I will be happy to explain it. My personal favorite suggestion I got was, just don't be an asshole, bro. I make no promises about that one. One request from me, by the way, just something that came up in a couple suggestions, but this is from me to you, is this class goes from 3:10 to 4. I certainly understand your time is very valuable, and a lot of competing demands are on your time. But do please realize the class does go till 4. So please, as best you can, refrain from packing up early when folks start kind of shuffling and making noise at 5 till. Makes it a little tough to finish out the lecture, so please do think of that. If you're someone who has a work shift that starts right at 4 or something like that, please do feel free to let me know. That's totally fine. But if that's the case, please try to do things such as packing up quietly and maybe picking a seat near the door. All sound good? Cool, great. We've got our standards for ourselves. Oh, one other thing that was a little bit of a surprise is a lot of folks asked me to tell the penguin biting me story, so I'll tell it in about 30 seconds here. It was working in New Zealand. We were doing work on this species of seabird called a gray-faced petrel. Really cool pelagic seabirds. They live in these burrows out on sort of the steep headlands and the edges of these islands in New Zealand. My colleague and I were going around putting geolocator tags on these species. And the way you catch these birds is to find their burrows, a nesting colony, and reach shoulder deep into these holes in the ground. Luckily, some natural history knowledge of New Zealand told us that there's nothing venomous out there, so it's kind of safe. A nice thing we're thinking about the natural history of the area, made sure that we were safe in doing this. By the way, that's what the babies look like. Pretty cute. Problem is that often these petrel burrows will get taken over by little blue penguins, also known as fairy penguins, smallest penguin in the world. They look cute, but they got the devil in them. Not great. And so there's just one day we were out sampling these petrels. I reached into a burrow. The little blue penguin tends to be hanging out by the edge of the burrow. Went for my shoulder, 2 stitches. So there's the penguin story. Talk to any biologists. We all have fun stories like this. It's cool to chat about, but come to office hours for that. All right. So one quick thing. I mentioned on Tuesday that we do have sort of this assignment, our habitat account assignment that you guys will all do over the course of the quarter, right? So I just want to talk about a bit more. You'll have 3 sort of entries that you do for this assignment. They're about 400 or 500 words apiece spread out over the course of the quarter, right? And you will write accounts about a certain habitat in California in different ways. It might be something about an endangered species. It might be some cultural practice or history there. You have some options. And so within your lab section, which again will start this coming Monday, you'll have a group of 2 or 3 other folks who are doing the same habitat as you are. You guys will kind of talk, chat, share resources, collaborate to complete this. You'll do peer reviews on each other's entries and just kind of help each other out, right? I have now posted an overview PDF and a rubric and assignment prompt for the first assignment on Canvas, so take a look at that. It's in a module called Habitat Account, something like that. And please keep in mind your first due date on that is a week from today. All you need to do is kind of go through, think about what sort of themes and habitats you want to write about. And there's a lot of potential there, right? You could do something like writing about the adaptations of a bird species like the black skimmer in California. Really unique coastal bird that has a really weird behavior and has a morphology, how it looks from the outside, that reflects that behavior. You could do something like a conservation plan for one of our alpine specialists, like the American pika, right? Certainly be good. You could do something like looking at indigenous practices of the local indigenous tribes around here for things like prescribed burns to preserve biodiversity in grasslands, shrublands, that sort of thing, right? So take a look at the assignment PDF. Has sort of a list of what you can do, all the different things you could approach with, but keep that in mind. That starts next week. Any questions on that stuff? Peachy, you guys are making this easy. OK. So let's talk about the ecological history of California. The point of this class is to go through all the biomes and habitats and diversity we have in the state. It's really incredible. But to kind of give a foundation for all of that, I want to spend today talking about how we got here. How California, from a biological natural history standpoint, got to be the way it is, because it is really, really cool. This art, and it always breaks my heart, I cannot find the original attribution of the artist, is what this area, Davis, California, might have looked like as recently as 11,000 years ago. This is during the Pleistocene, this sort of pre-human arrival to the North American continent landscape. A lot of wetlands, grasslands, fires, trees, savanna, massive amounts of megafauna. You ever heard the term megafauna before? Mega, big, fauna, animal, big animal. Megafauna is this jargony term that talks about large wildlife, elephants, tigers, that sort of thing. And North America had a ton of megafauna, still has some, but we'll talk about that. So, by the end of today, the hope is that all of us in this room can kind of explain how state factors, state meaning a way of being, not a geographical state, such as climate, topography, geology, time, the history of an area, really shape the distribution of ecosystems, habitats, and animals in California. Right? We'll sort of talk about how we got to where we are. And then once we understand those mechanisms, how all that stuff works, we'll be able to apply that knowledge in the history of California to get a better understanding of how we see the distributions, abundances, differences between communities of modern species in North America, specifically California, right? Sound good? Awesome. OK, so we will talk a little bit about terminology here. So the first thing I want to talk about is ecosystems. And an ecosystem is probably a term most of us heard before. Who's heard the term ecosystem in some context or another? Yeah. When it comes to actually defining an ecosystem, it's this very broad term that describes this community of organisms, living things, together with the non-living, also known as abiotic, components of an area, right? The interactions between the plants, vertebrates, insects, microorganisms, soil, climate, everything in a certain area is the ecosystem. It is all of those components and, sometimes more importantly, how they interact with each other, how energy, nutrients, resources cycle through in and out of that ecosystem. Everything is very interconnected. We're very zen in ecology and in wildlife biology. Right? So this is just an example. Don't feel the need to know this. This is a diagram of how nitrogen, really, really important element and a nutrient for plant communities, cycles through an ecosystem. Nitrogen is everywhere in the atmosphere. Specialized organism can pull it out of the atmosphere and turn it into an available nutrient in the soil. It cycles through fungi, plants, animals, all these different systems and becomes sort of this perpetual motion machine, we hope, that continues to cycle through a system. So lots of different ecosystem processes are like this. Ecosystem is the whole thing. When we talk about just the living component, so ignoring the rocks, the rain, things like that, we call that a community. One of those things that just kind of has a specific definition. And these ecosystems are often kind of sorted by humans, because we like to have common characteristics and sort things, into biomes. Have you heard the term biome before? Yeah, a biome, kind of broadly speaking, is sort of a type of ecosystem. These living organisms and these living communities that sort of share certain characteristics. And some of these biomes, these sort of broad definitions or descriptions of an area, might be familiar to you. Tundra, taiga, grass savanna, dry steppe, right? As humans, as natural historians, as ecologists, we often will take and look at the characteristics of an ecosystem, find areas that are similar, kind of focus on those similarities and study them, right? So we talk about biomes as being these areas with shared characteristics in both their biotic communities and their abiotic factors, which we'll talk about a lot today. Right? We also hear the term habitat. I'd imagine most of us have heard the term habitat. Show of hands. Yeah, habitat is kind of a localized instance of a biome, right? So often when we talk about a habitat, we'll talk about a species habitat, an individual animal's habitat. A habitat is a specific area we're talking about that has some characteristic or set of characteristics of interest for us, right? Individual species might even have a bunch of different habitats, right? A migratory bird might have a wintering habitat. It might migrate and have a migratory route. It might have breeding habitat somewhere else, right? So individual animals and species can have different habitats. When we talk about a habitat, we're just talking about an area that an animal or potentially a plant or other organism uses, right? And so obviously in terms of conservation, what we like to do is look at the biodiversity, how much diversity of life we have in these different biomes and habitats, and identify areas where it's unusually high, unusually variable. We have a lot of different species of plants, animals, whatever interested, right? And so one of the things that's been done by conservationists over long periods of time is identifying biodiversity hotspots, areas that are disproportionately shown to have a lot of different variability in their ecosystems or habitats or communities, even their biomes, right? And so different conservation organizations have kind of done this in different ways, and there's some variability as to what exactly gets defined as a biodiversity hotspot. One we see kind of often is an area that has more than 1,500 species of endemic plants. Talk about what endemic means in a second here. Anyone heard that term before? Yeah, it's getting a little bit more into the jargon, but fairly simple definition. And in a lot of cases, these are areas that have lost already at least 70% of their primary native vegetation. We'll also talk about what native means in this context, right? So when we talk about biodiversity hotspots, often we're talking about areas that have a lot of diversity, a lot of varied habitat, a lot of interesting life, and might be under threat from various factors, most often human, right? So you might recognize a couple of these. The South American rainforest, we see Madagascar, this really unique, massive island off the coast of Africa here. A couple spots in Australia there. A lot of this Oceania area has unique island biodiversity. But you might also know that the California Floristic Province, where we are now, is included as a world biodiversity hotspot. So we're going to talk about why. All right, a couple more terms to know. When we talk about native species, we're talking about species in an area that evolved there. Species that differentiated from whatever its ancestral thing was and evolved and sort of became what it was in the area it's now found in. It wasn't introduced later on, spread by domestication, introduced by humans, something like that. A native species is an animal or plant or organism that was originally found and evolved in the region where it still occurs, right? The alternative is a non-native species. Sometimes we call them invasive species if they're doing damage, right? Who's heard the term invasive species before? Yeah, interesting stuff. But there's a little bit of sort of a subset of native species and an endemic species. We mentioned that term a second ago. in a region are species that are found, they're native to that area and nowhere else. An endemic species is a species that is found in the spot where it occurs, one specific area, and nowhere else. So a California endemic species would be an animal, plant, whatever you can find in California and nowhere else on Earth. It's pretty cool. And one of the ways we identify these biodiversity hotspots is by the levels of endemism. How much uniqueness, how many unique plants, animals, et cetera, are in a habitat or area, right? In California, we have quite a bit of endemism. It's one of the reasons we have that designation as a biodiversity hotspot, right? We have a lot of invertebrates and plants, really, really high in terms of endemism. A little bit less for vertebrates for a couple of reasons. You might be able to think of some, but we'll talk about that later on. But still, we have quite a few endemic vertebrates. Vertebrate species, again, animals with a backbone, that's a vertebrate, that are found in California and nowhere else, which is pretty cool. At least 60 vertebrates are only found in California. 60 different species of animals with backbones. These are mammals, reptiles, fish, that sort of thing. Animals that we really think of as sort of, from a human perspective, more complex and evolved, right? And we also have a lot more subspecies. What is a species and what is a subspecies can get really, really complicated really fast. But there are a lot of subspecies, sort of sub-pockets of a certain organism species that only occur in California. Make sense? Any questions on kind of this terminology stuff? Any thoughts? Awesome. If you think of anything, feel free to raise your hand. Interestingly, this endemism among vertebrates in California is especially high for amphibians, rodents, and freshwater fishes. Ever thought as to why that might be? Why might endemism, only being found in one certain limited area, be more common for something like a fish or an amphibian than something like a large bird? Any thoughts on that? Yeah?
Usually with what animals, they have to live in like specific conditions, like the most specialists.
Yeah. Some of it has to do with sort of the conditions that are required for an animal to exist. Amphibians have much more specific needs. Often they need moisture, wet environments. Any other thoughts? Yeah?
Birds can travel great distances, like across continents, but if you have a rodent or a freshwater fish, it can't really leave its natural habitat as easily.
Exactly, right? So the thought is that it has to do with something we call dispersal capability, how good you are at moving around. If you're a large bird, it's pretty easy to move from one area to the next. You might spread out, you might migrate, whatever the case may be. But if you're a little rodent or an amphibian, your whole range across your entire lifetime might be a couple hundred meters. So it's more common to see these pockets of unique little speciation show up, right? So this is our biodiversity hotspot. This is the California floristic province. As I said, we have a lot of endemism in California. For plants alone, more than 2,000 plant species that occur here are nowhere else in the entire world, which is pretty cool, right? We have things like our California larkspur. It's our unique species of larkspur. It's a really beautiful blue flower. We have a species of manzanita that shows up here and nowhere else. It's only on the Channel Islands, I believe. So lots of plants. In fact, it's the majority of native California plant species. When I say California, I'm referring to this entire floristic province, which extends into Oregon and Mexico. So keep that in mind. That occur nowhere else. More than half of our plant species are only found in this floristic province. And a lot of really cool endemic animals too, right? Have you ever seen a giant kangaroo rat? Cool, nice, down in the Mojave. They are very, very cute, right? Really, really interesting little animals. I say little, but they're the largest dipodomous kangaroo rat we have in North America. So pretty cool. How about Gymnogyps californianus? Anyone recognize this particular species? Anyone feel like shouting out its common name? Close, very close. California condor, yeah, excellent. So it is in that same family as the vultures, but it's a California condor. Only found now in California. Used to have a larger range, but not so much anymore, right? So let's think for a sec. Why is California so biodiverse, right? I talked about how we have a lot of endemism, a lot of unique species, a lot of really cool biodiversity in our area. Let's think about this for a second. In fact, let's chat a little bit. Let's take a couple minutes and have a conversation with one another and see if we can just kind of think about why we might see so much biodiversity in California relative to some other places. This is a great chance to brainstorm. We'll take a couple minutes, talk to each other, make a new friend, shake hands with somebody next to you, and see if we come up with anything. Safe place to guess. So let's chat. We'll check in about 2 or 3 minutes. All right. Anyone have any thoughts, guesses, ideas on this? Why is it that we see so much diversity in endemism in California? What is it about this area that might make it a refuge for a lot of different communities? Any ideas on this? Yeah.
We have a lot of mountains surrounding the state and along the borders, so animals and plants can't transport or travel over the mountains, and animals carrying plant species and seeds.
Yeah.
Should change it.
That's excellent. That's a really good one. Natural barriers. We have a lot of mountain ranges in California, right? Unless you're a very large bird, and even then, it can be really hard to cross a mountain range. I've tried it. It's not fun. A lot of us probably have, right? But it can be sort of this natural barrier that stops certain animals from dispersing into wider areas. They evolve here, but they can't spread as efficiently as they could in a large open flat space. Yeah, Alex.
California is like a really big state, and it houses a lot of different habitats compared to other states.
That is the other big one here, right? California's big, right? It's a large area, so there's a lot of potential for different habitats. But even compared to other areas of similar size, California contains a lot of diversity in habitat, right? We have these high mountains. We have the Sierra, these massive granite spurs. We have different types of mountains in the Northwest, things like the Trinity Alps that have a totally different geological history. We have deserts. We have wetlands. We have deciduous forests. We have coniferous forests. We have coast, certainly, a massive addition of habitats, fishes, near coastal systems, all this stuff, right? And so California, when it comes to habitats, biomes, all this stuff, is really, really complex, right? So let's kind of put this in perspective, right? So if we kind of wonder where and how these different species occur, a lot of it has to do with this diversity of habitat. Abby, do you have a thought?
Yeah. So with the condors and they're endemic, but they used to have a larger range, couldn't we technically make a species endemic by killing them?
Yeah, if you're really keen to get more endemic species in your area, please don't do this, you can go out and kill them everywhere else, right? But often when we talk about endemism, we talk about sort of natural range and natural spread. And there are quite a few species that are pretty endangered right now that have experienced those reduced ranges or reduction in ranges, right? So endemism and what is a native species can be debated in that way, right? It's a really good question. But please don't go out and kill a bunch of species so we can get an endemic native species, right? It's a good observation. So we look at patterns of where different groups occur, right? We kind of see some interesting things that we as natural historians can kind of look at and start to wonder about, why does this show up like this? So here, this is from our California Natural Atlas. We're looking at something called species richness. When we talk about species richness, it's just this term that means the number of species. Species richness. It's one way to measure biodiversity. So over on the left, we see the species richness of amphibians. How many different species of amphibians occur in different parts of California? And as the green gets more intense, it means there are more species. Ditto over here for reptile species. How many species of reptile we get in certain areas of California? Anyone notice anything about these ranges? Similarities, differences, anything like that? Anything jump out? Any patterns we see? Again, we're being natural historians in here. No observation is a wrong observation. Yeah? Yeah, not even necessarily just near the coast, but that's a big one, right? We see large patterns of amphibian diversity in areas that might be wetter, right? Amphibians rely, by definition, things like frogs, salamanders, they lay their eggs in water. They have to have access to some moisture, right? How about the reptiles? We see a difference there in the back?
I mean, the reptiles are more in the desert areas, but I think it's really interesting that the amphibians and reptiles don't have a lot of overlap.
Yeah. It's interesting. We don't see some overlap. There are areas where some amphibians and some reptiles do occur. They're not excluding each other necessarily. But yeah, right? We've kind of made some observations here that explain this pattern we're seeing, right? We tend to see higher species richness of reptiles in hot, dry areas. We see higher species richness of amphibians in cool, moist areas, coastal forests, wetlands, that sort of thing, right? And so it's this really interesting phenomenon where we see different groups of vertebrates occurring in different regions that meet their ecological needs, right? This is how evolution happens. And because we have such different ecosystems in California, we have these zones that are very conducive, very supportive of these various groups. Make sense? It's not always sort of an either or. Sometimes different groups like the same conditions, right? On the left, we have species richness of waterfowl. We have over 30 species of waterfowl, ducks, geese, and swans, that occur in California. And then over here, we have freshwater fishes. It turns out both waterfowl and fishes like water. Write that down, right? And so we have areas that are conducive to both groups. Not always are these habitats complementary, but often they have support offered to the same groups or to different groups. OK, so this is kind of the pattern we see. California is very diverse, not just in terms of its animals, but in terms of the habitats and ecosystems that support those animals, right? Let's talk about why that happens. What makes an ecosystem happen? And so we're going to spend the next little bit of the lecture here, and really the majority of it, talking about the major ecosystem processes that define an area and dictate over often vast periods of time what actually shows up, what evolves, and what we eventually get living within our various biomes. Make sense? And so we're going to talk sort of in sequence of time scale about all of these. So things like the topography, the surface. Is it smooth? Is it flat? Is it jagged? Is it steep? Right? Very influential for what can survive in an area. Talk about climate, right? Temperature and precipitation, massively important. I come close to dying every summer in Davis. I'm not well adapted to hot weather. I'm massive, right? And so climate can be huge and very influential when it comes to determining vertebrate communities. Parent material, this is a term we hear a lot, the types of rocks and soil that influence an area. You've ever heard of serpentine soils? Really kind of cool thing. It's our state mineral, or state soil type in California. But sort of the rock and the minerals and the soil composition can be very influential. Time is critical. What happens over time? Are things stable? Are they very chaotic? Are they variable? Are they always hot? Are they hot and cold? All kinds of things like that. And then even things like potential biota. We talked about dispersal capability. Are you in an area that's accessible to a slug? Or are you in an area that probably only very mobile animals like large mammals and birds can get to, right? So all of these things come together. They interact over various timescales to dictate how a habitat and how a biome develops. Make sense? Any questions on this? Any thoughts going through folks' minds? Fantastic. Please, never be afraid to raise your hand if anything pops into your head, right? Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about is how California actually came to be as a landmass. And so we're going to go back way far back in terms of geological time. And if we look at North America, 90 million years ago, which in terms of geology is not all that long ago, California really didn't exist much above the water, right? We just kind of had this formation of the West Coast that was just starting to show up. 90 million years ago, the Pangea supercontinent has broken up. The tectonic plates that make up the surface of the Earth are moving around. A lot of you probably already know that the crust of the Earth, the surface, is not one intact piece of rock. It's all sort of these frozen and really congealed pieces of lava that move around, bump into each other, kind of grind each other up and down. That's why we get things like earthquakes and volcanoes. And so even 90 million years ago, we don't really see much in terms of California appearing above the surface of the water. And even 60 million years ago, we have this large-scale tectonic movement that we'll talk about in a moment here that is just starting to bring California up from the depths of the ocean and into the surface world, right? And the major process in terms of tectonic movements, these massive, literally earth-shaking processes that lead to changes in continental structure, the one that was most influential in making California the way it is called subduction, right? And subduction is this geological process where two of these incredibly, unfathomably massive tectonic plates bump into each other. And when you have two unstoppable forces meeting each other in contrasting directions like that, something's got to give. And subduction is the geologic process that occurs when one of these plates eventually kind of slides up over the other and subdues, below, the other plate, right? So in California, we had this old tectonic plate that doesn't really exist anymore called the Farallon plate. Farallon plate basically means the west coast of California and starts getting subdued by the Pacific plate, right? This is an incredibly violent process when it comes to tectonic plates, right? If you think about taking two pieces of fabric and pushing them together, even if one eventually slides through the other, you get a lot of wrinkling and sort of contortion and this sort of thing. And that happens on incredible geologic scales when it comes to tectonic subduction. When one massive plate of rock subdues another, you have things like the formation of mountain range. You don't just get fabric wrinkling, you get the landscape wrinkling and upheaving. You get volcanoes, you get tsunamis, you get earthquakes, right? One of the reasons we get so many earthquakes in California is that a lot of our area is along the meeting of multiple tectonic plates. You get things like orogeny, which is this kind of bizarre geological word that sort of means the formation of mountain ranges, right? So a really incredibly massive, awe-inspiring process on a geological scale. This led to the uplift of the Sierra Nevada, almost all of our mountain ranges in California, right? And so again, we had the Farallon plate pushing towards the west coast, hits the Pacific plate, and is subdued, and sort of starts to be ground under and breaks into a couple of different pieces. This making sense to folks in general? We'll talk about this quite a bit more, right? And so here's what it really looks like, right? You have the Farallon plate coming in, hitting the west coast, breaking into pieces, and upheaving mountains, creating volcanoes, all this really intense stuff. So you have, again, Farallon plate coming in, and apologies, I actually misspoke. I always get these two mixed up. The Farallon plate hits the North American plate, not the Pacific plate, my mistake. Farallon hits the North American plate, begins subduing, becoming subducted. Don't worry too much about these specific geological boundaries. I'm not expecting you to know this, but more the broad process that led to this. Then the Pacific plate comes out of nowhere with a steel chair and breaks the Farallon plate in two pieces, right? So it stops being the Farallon plate, becomes the Cocos plate and the Juan de Fuca plate. Juan de Fuca plate's still kind of around. The Cocos plate is almost entirely gone. But this is this process by which these massive geological plates come through, right? As this is happening, mountain ranges are upheaved. Volcanoes start spewing mud and magma and lava out into the open air, right? We get this massive movement of parent material. Different types of rock and minerals that are erupting up from the Earth's mantle where these plates are coming together and are getting distributed everywhere across this fault line where these tectonic plates are meeting. So if we kind of break this down, condensing tens of millions of years into seconds, this is kind of what it looks like, right? At the start of this, we have a Farallon plate. There's not a ton of landmass on the west coast here. We kind of have these approximations of what the areas that will become the US states are doing right now. It's about 40 million years ago-ish. And then as this happens, Farallon plate moves into North America, is crushed, broken into pieces by the Pacific plate. But then very importantly, about 20 years ago, you have this change. The Pacific plate kind of changes directions and starts doing what we call a transverse movement or a translation movement up the edge of the west coast. Essentially, instead of having these two plates going like this, you have them sliding next to each other, right? And believe it or not, as sort of arbitrary as it sounds, that's really important for geology and the formation of habitats over geological time. You saw our states kind of getting stretched out to where they were here. Because the fact is, when that happens, it really distributes what we call parent material. The rock, minerals, all the pieces that are composing these tectonic plates, right? And when these things move, it distributes different types of parent material, different minerals, different nutrients, all these things that make up ecosystems eventually over large areas. And so accretion, mergings of a lot of different exotic terrains, sort of source materials, rocks, minerals, that sort of thing, were spread out over this whole area as this was happening, right? It's a clunky metaphor, but California is basically a pizza somebody tried to slide under a door. Imagine a nice pizza with a lot of toppings on it. You try to slide it through this door. It's too low. I don't know why you would, but maybe you did. All these pizza toppings get bunched up, scrunched together, and kind of mixed, right? And so as you have a lot of tectonic activity, you see a lot of different rock types, different parent materials, different minerals, rocks, all this stuff. They get spread around where all this tectonic activity was occurring, right? So a lot of diversity in terms of the rock that gets deposited. You can think of all of these different parts of tectonic plates being different sort of pieces of Play-Doh. Over geological time, they get mixed up, and you end up with this really mixed, diverse habitat in terms of rock, right? Is more or less making sense to folks? Any questions on this? Awesome. Because it turns out that with that geological stuff, you don't just get a lot of different parent material types in your different regions, but you get a lot of different topography. Topography being the characteristic of the surface, how jagged it is, right? And I love talking about this in California, because you might recognize some of the major features of the state. San Francisco Bay Area over here, LA is down here. We are, of course, in the Central Valley, sort of low, flat area that used to be a massive wetland a long time ago. We got the Sierra Nevada. But there's so much variability in the topography, the elevation, the slopes, all the stuff of California, that we have not only the highest point in the continental US, anyone know what it is? Highest point in California? Yeah, Mount Whitney. Yeah, right, so we have Mount Whitney, about 14,500 feet. We even have the lowest point in the continental US, which is a part of Death Valley called Badwater, 300 feet below sea level. California is so topographically diverse that the highest and lowest point of the continental United States are about 80 miles away from each other. Crazy, right? All of these different parts of topography have different habitats that are available. Alpine, lowland wetland, grassland, all these different things that offer different opportunities for different animal communities to develop, right? We also, across California, have a lot of variation in precipitation here, right? So here's our map of elevation in California. Dark green is very low, dark brown is very high. Of course, this is our Sierra Nevada. And here we have a map of how much rain different regions of California get, right? With our very high rain areas being in purple here, northwest coast, Eureka, and very dry areas down in the southeast. Take a look at these maps side by side for a second and see if anything jumps out to you. Again, on the left, we have our rainfall, annual, on average. On our right, we have our topography and elevation here. So let's chat for a minute or two and see if we see anything that stands out to us. Sound good? talk for a couple minutes, meet a new neighbor, see if anything stands out. We'll reconvene in 2 minutes. All right, putting on our natural historian hats here. We're scientists looking at these two maps. Anyone see anything that stands out to them? Any observations to be made about these two maps side by side? Again, very safe place to guess. No ideas, similarities, differences? I invite you all to be brave. Who thinks that these maps look entirely different, that there's no connection whatsoever between precipitation and topography? Who thinks they see some kind of connection, some similarity, right? Yeah, right? I think you're probably right. We do see certain patterns here. In areas of high elevation, and specifically on the western end of mountain ranges in California, we tend to see a lot of green on the left side, a lot more precipitation. Whereas areas in the south, areas of lower elevation here, areas on the east side of the mountain ranges, all this stuff, tend to get smaller amounts of precipitation. That seems fair? We agree with that, we think? And have anything to add to that one? Yeah. Yes, excellent, very well said. The rain shadow effect. Who's heard of rain shadows before? I grew up in a rain shadow. They're very comfortable. So basically it's this idea that the topography of an area has an effect on the precipitation. They're not independent. And a lot of it does have to do with that exact thing we call the rain shadow effect. So California is a coastal state, and so our predominant winds come from the ocean. Most wind in California tends to move from west to east. Most weather currents and weather patterns move inland from the coast. And so it turns out that because these mountain ranges were formed, we have these natural barriers and these series of ridge lines that form. Because of the orientation of those tectonic plates, our mountains tend to run north to south, which is, of course, perpendicular. Here's our California coast. Perpendicular to predominant winds. Here are our mountain ranges running north to south. It's beautiful, right? And because of that, that actually affects how weather pattern forms. When air rises, it cools. Cool air can hold less moisture, so the moisture in the air tends to condense and drop precipitation, rain or snow, as it is cooling off. So as this wind coming off of the ocean rises over these mountain ranges, whether it be the coast ranges or the Sierra, it drops moisture on the west side of those mountain ranges. When that air passes the mountain ranges, it hits the east side, not only has it deposited and depleted some of its moisture, but it's also heating up and lowering down. Warm air can hold more moisture, so it's less likely to rain. Because of that, we get these areas in the lee, and sort of the sheltered side of a mountain range, that we call rain shadows. Areas that don't get as much rain because of the relationship between air and precipitation here, right? Does that make sense to everyone? It's a really critical thing when it comes to weather patterns, not only on this sort of massive statewide thing, but even in terms of one ridgeline. Sometimes you can look at a ridgeline and see an entirely different community of plants and sometimes animals on one side of the ridge than the other. There are other factors like sunlight that play into that, but really, really foundational aspect of how climates develop around regions, right? And it really is this climate that is one of the most influential factors outside of geological time and formation that determines what kind of ecosystem, what kind of biome, what kind of habitat we see in a given area, right? And the type of what we would see as sort of terrain type that develops in an area is often sort of this two-factor function of how hot things are and how wet things are, right? So on one end of the spectrum, by the way, it's a little confusing, but hotter temperatures are on the lower end of this graph. Cooler temperatures are on the higher end of this graph. Drier conditions are here. Wetter conditions are over here. And so, for example, if you have a very wet, very hot area, you might get a tropical forest developing, right? No one's super shocked that if you have a very warm, wet, humid region, a tropical forest might evolve there. If you have a very, very cold, dry area where no rain ever falls, you get a frozen wasteland, a tundra, right? Fairly barren, not a lot of movement of nutrients, water, that sort of thing. Things might be intermediate. If it's fairly hot and dry, you get a desert. if you get a little bit of moisture, you might get some grasses growing, get something like a savanna, some grasslands. We have this thing called a Mediterranean climate, which is very relevant to California. But this is just this kind of idea that as you sort of slide these two levers of heat and precipitation and moisture, different ecosystems will develop in certain areas. Does that make some intuitive sense to folks? Anyone saying like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah, totally fine if you are, right? No worries. So this is kind of this very, very coarse. This is not a recipe. You can't say, if I get exactly 150 centimeters of precipitation and the average temperature is 11 degrees C, it will be a deciduous forest. But it's kind of this sort of general guideline about how this develops. By the way, if anyone's curious why this only kind of happens on half of our chart space, it's because conditions like this don't really happen. You can't really have an area that is this cold and has that much precipitation because the air can't hold any moisture, and so it doesn't move around anymore. This cannot really exist as physics exists on Earth. Question?
Is there a specific reason why some of the biomes are just bigger than others?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of that just kind of has to do with these broad definitions of different habitats. And if you ask someone who's like a habitat ecologist, they'll say, well, I have 16,822 subdivisions of tropical forest and 11,000 different grassland types. Don't take these as absolute measurements. This is kind of a general guide of how things tend to be. It's a good question. And one of the cool things about California is that we have different areas that represent just about, nearly, all of the chart space here, right? A place like Gasky on the north coast, right? We have a lot of precipitation, fairly warm. Not that warm, so we see something like temperate deciduous forest out here, some coniferous forest, obviously. We have places like Imperial, right, that are very, very hot. We have places like Death Valley, they're incredibly dry, right? We have different areas, different regions of California that represent all of these varying conditions, right? And so when we combine a lot of these sort of state factors, parent material, how rock formed, topography, precipitation, all of this stuff together, we see that when we combine something like the geological areas of California, and this is one way to define the different parent materials and different rocks in California. Combine that with things like different bioregions that are often sort of defined by the amount of temperature and precipitation, right? A lot of variability along both of those states. When you put it together, you get this very, very complex mosaic of different habitat types. Regions of California that experience very different conditions and come together in different ways. All those little colors represent some different habitat type, right? Obviously, this changes over time. Sometimes these conditions are very, very stable. They stay the same over centuries and centuries. Sometimes they change very drastically. When ice ages ended, for example, we had areas that completely changed their animal community because the climate changed a lot. Then we also have things that we call refugia, plural of refuge, where conditions might be more stable. Famous example of this in California is fan palms, right? Fan palms used to be in a lot of places in California. When the ice age came, most recent ice age, most of the fan palm distribution in California was gone. We had these little refuges around hot springs where it stayed warm enough for the fan palms to survive. So things can be differentially stable depending on where and when you are. And this continues to change over time. A lot of us have probably heard of climate change. It's kind of a hot topic right now, not to blow anyone's mind. But we expect and we try to predict as natural historians based on what we have observed and what we know about these natural systems, what might change. As things heat up, we might expect to see shifts in elevation. Animals that used to be found at lower elevations might move to higher elevations to get a little bit cooler temperatures, things like that. So we try to use this information. All right. This making sense to folks? This is kind of how we got to where we are in terms of why we see so much biodiversity. Any questions here? Awesome. So I just want to finish talking a little bit about what kind of happened to the vertebrate communities in recent history. When I say recent, I'm talking geological time, 11 to 60,000 years ago, as the case may be. The era we call Pleistocene, which is more or less post-dinosaur extinction before humans arrived in North America. And again, believe it or not, this is an actual representation of the kind of animals and diversity we would see in California prior to prehistoric human arrival. Not talking about colonization by Europeans, I'm talking about the arrival of the species Homo sapiens to North America. Because there was a long time, in terms of evolutionary history, that humans weren't in North America, but a lot of vertebrates were. So in short, mammal diversity specifically, all diversity, but really mammal diversity especially, was a lot higher in California before humans arrived. And specifically, the range of body sizes was much, much greater, largely owing to the presence of what we, again, call megafauna in North America. We used to have a lot of very large animals that occurred in California, a lot of them, right? There's a really famous study in the late 90s, kind of fun, that compared mammals in Southern California, specifically around the LA area, pre-human arrival to those that occur today, right? And there was a lot of variability. The fact is, in short, there are a couple reasons that those megafauna disappeared. One of the big ones we see a lot is the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, the idea that we as humans came to North America, probably across the Bering Strait, we're not entirely sure, arrived and said, wow, these mammoths look delicious, I'm gonna eat them all. And essentially sort of started overpopulating, overhunting, all the stuff that any kind of new animal arriving in the ecosystem does that led to a lot of decline and potentially a lot of extinctions. A lot of anthropological evidence of animal hunting and use, things like bones that have been processed, broken open by humans. But there were also climate changes, right? We had the end of the most recent ice age, and we had shifts in human populations. A lot of different factors might have been contributing to this, right? So there's some debate, but one of the biggest things is that probably human arrival did cause the extinction of a lot of these megafauna. But to give you an idea of how much this has changed, before, let's look at Los Angeles, just LA, right? Before humans arrived in the Pleistocene era, the black bear was, I think, number 31 or number 12? Anyway, not even in the top 10 of largest mammals in the Los Angeles area, what is now the Los Angeles area, right? We had at least, I think, 18 maybe, larger mammals that occurred in the same area. The biggest one being the Columbian mammoth, right? The woolly mammoth was there in any large numbers. Now, if you look at it now, black bear is the biggest. It's moved up quite a bit on the chain there, right? A lot of shift. And to kind of give you an idea, an illustration of this. Back in the day, the largest mammal used to be Columbian mammoth. It's now the black bear in the LA area. 10th largest used to be a grizzly bear. Grizzly bear was the 10th largest, not even top 9, right? Now, a jackrabbit, right? Is the 10th largest mammal we see around there. Big shifts. The puma, the mountain lion, used to be only the 20th largest. Now it's Merriam's chipmunk, right? So a pretty dramatic shift in size distributions of animals we'd see out there, right? So, quick recap of this, right? We talked a bit about what we see in terms of biodiversity patterns, hotspots, that sort of thing. And it really does matter for how we do conservation, how we act as natural historians. Realize that none of this is the most exciting looking at cool animals, but this background is really critical to understand why we see the patterns that we do. All of these state factors we talked about, climate, topography, parent material, time, everything really comes together to dictate what happens here, right? And so we talked a little bit about sort of the historic biota, what we used to see versus what we see now, and we'll talk about that a lot more through each of our ecosystems that we're going through. All right, I'll try to end, as I do, by introducing an ecological mystery for us to think about. This one is very relevant to California. You've never seen a pronghorn or pronghorn antelope? They're not actually antelope, but we call them antelope because they kind of look like them. In ecology and natural history, we often see this relationship between predators and prey, where prey evolve. There's kind of this war of adaptation and evolution to be just a little bit faster than their fastest predator, right? They just kind of have to be a little faster. If they're a lot faster, it's kind of a waste of energy. There's no reason to use that, right? But in North America, since we've been looking at this as scientists at least, we've noticed that pronghorn are kind of weird. They're the second fastest land animal in the world. They go really, really fast, way faster than any predator that could potentially catch them. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's kind of confusing, right? Because why would they evolve to go that fast when there's nothing that could even come close to catching up to that? Turns out we figured out why, right? And so we'll leave that. We'll talk about that on Tuesday. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. Happy to talk about this, and thank you all very much.